Hi folks, Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a book called Future Shock. It was written by Alvin Toffler. I think you can still get that. It's still in print as far as I know. And I was introduced to this book, I suppose, I was maybe 22, 23, something like that. And it was a book, a bestseller back in the day. It was a book about Alvin Toffler predicting the future, saying, well, this is how society is changing. This is how technology is changing. This is how economic structures are changing as a result of the technology. And therefore, this is how our lives will be affected, and we'll be leading different lives as a result. Now, some of these technological changes aren't necessarily right at the forefront of things. We don't go from, the horse and cart directly to rockets going to Mars. There's a lot of small steps in between, each one enabling and facilitating the next technological step. So there can be hundreds of little incremental steps that can create in effect, world-changing events. Some examples of this going back into, say, the mercantile age in the late 1400s, early 1500s, was the changes, multiple changes, almost simultaneously in A, ship design, B, the structure of riggings and sails and the pulleys that were used to direct and control and position those sails, and also advances in navigational equipment. The combination of those three meant that instead of sailing short distances close to the coastline, or only crossing from coastline to coastline through across an internal sea, for example, the Mediterranean, instead of that open ocean going vessels were now possible. And this is when you saw the Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Magellan, and other of these Portuguese and Italian and Spanish seafarers that were crossing vast oceans, which hadn't been done previously. And this of course was created monumental change around the world because of those technologies. Now, each one in isolation, so we're rigging and pulleys to raise and control sails. So fucking what? That's bullshit. That's nothing. But it wasn't. It was actually game changing at the time. Now consider how we live differently today. We used to go out to drive-in movie theaters or go to the movie theaters, and we'd have to jump in the car and put on half decent clothes, put on those skin tight jeans and all that sort of stuff we used to do before going to the movies. And now we can sit in our homes watching it on our computers or on our iPhones or something like that. So that's a huge that technology has created a very substantial social change, behavioural social change. So, and this is what Future Shock was looking at. Now, I remember when I first read it, I thought it was pretty far-fetched, but there was a lot of stuff going around at the time. There's particularly in the 60s, there was the spawning all these, Lost in Space, the TV show, Star Trek. Then, Gene Roddenberry was Isaac Asimov in his sci-fi futuristic novels, 2001: Space Odyssey. There's a lot of stuff going around that was looking at the future. And bear in mind that the world had gone from horse and cart as the primary means of transport to landing on the moon, sending a rocket landing men on the moon in 65 years. So this was technologically, this is a chasm of difference, and so people were looking at that and saying, well, given those leaps in technology and the changes in not necessarily how the average person in the street would live, but these changes that we can say we're going to be landing on Mars in another 25 years' time. Now, some of these were, of course, very far-fetched. The real technology that changes things isn't the one-offs like going to the moon, as impressive as it was, by the way, and it was. It's where technology affects many people, say in the advanced economies anyway, affects the majority of the population and over a very short period of time. So there's large social changes compressed into a short time span. So that's where the real sort of future shock is, and this is, I think, what Alvin Toffler was getting at. So I'll just do a little summary here of what Toffler was on about. I'll have to summarize this on the fly. The subject's huge, and I'm going to try and knock it into minutes rather than hours. Okay, so Toffler was arguing that the world was already in an industrial society. Remember, this is the post-World War II era where the rebuilding's still going on, and this is very much in, I think it was first published in 1970, so he was saying that society is going from an industrial society, which already was, and at the time we were seeing this was pre the computer revolution. So this was the electronic revolution, where household electronics, hi-fi equipment, refrigerators, kitchen implements, all that sort of stuff, that the electrical revolution, that was going on. And that was substantially changing household work. I remember my grandmother spending all day in the kitchen, doing things like baking bread, and then suddenly there was all this electronic equipment around to do things. So things that would have taken an hour were now taking 10 minutes. You didn't have to bake the bread. You go down to the grocery store, the supermarket, and buy sliced bread. So a lot of changes there, and this was changed the amount of time people needed to be in the household. These idea of order, there's things that we take for granted now, like a washing machine that you can set for washing the clothes. You can set it and where it'll do the spin dry, and that would change a 2.5 hour gig into a 40-minute gig, and so on. So these big. So when you've got so many labor saving devices, labor and time then gets deployed in other areas, and this creates great social change. So coming back to this. Alvin Toffler said that this is a super industrial society was the next stage beyond an industrial society, because that involved change at the street level, technological, for example, getting your sliced bread or the kitchen automation products and so on. Again, remember, this is pre-computer and therefore pre-internet. And he was saying that this is going to cause levels of social dislocation and stress on social structures because of these changes that are happening in such a short space of time. They're not being fed in over many decades. They're coming with a sort of almost a brutal thud as they appear. And even back then, he was talking about information overload as news stations were trying to differentiate themselves in cutting edge news being the first. The breaking news, news analysis, current affairs shows, which turned into ridiculous. I remember some of those when I was a kid. Even as a kid, looking at it, saying, "Oh, that's bullshit. They're just trying to gin that up and just trying to make it super dramatic and so on." But this information overload was something that Toffler believed was going to be and was and still is today a big issue. So he developed or he produced a theory which is close to self-evident in some ways, that there was the agrarian society, which sort of dovetailed into the mercantile society, then the industrial society as the Industrial Revolution kicked off. Now, the Industrial Revolution is treated as something more, because there in fact was multiple industrial revolutions. There was the sort of initial parts like steam engines and pumps and things like that. Then that moved into, say, combustion engines, which then moved into aircraft and jet engines, which then moved into we're looking at then the electronics revolution that I mentioned before, washing machines that were affordable for everybody, and then going into the technological, the computer age. So the industrial age, in fact, went through many phases, and Toffler argues that each phase creates its own, as he referred to, super ideology, and this is important at this part. And this ideology is something that is where the real change occurs, because it's more the forced change than the natural change. The natural change is, for example, you get a washing machine and you get you buy your sliced bread at the store, and that suddenly now has given you an extra 5 hours a day of supposed leisure time, or you can go and spend somewhere else. Maybe you want to go and get a job or something, or go back to school and study something. So that's a natural organic change. That's a result of cheaper, more productive implements there. Now, the super ideology that Toffler is referring to isn't where it just happens naturally and organically. It becomes a product of moving through these phases. And whether you look at each ideology of each phase being an extra level of barbarity or civilizational improvement or something is another matter. But now the very early sort of big donk computers were called mainframe computers, where the power that you've got in your iPhone needed an entire large room of computing to have the equivalent, back in say the 70s. And I remember going, I went into a computer museum in where was, I think it was Minneapolis years ago, and they were showing the first disk drive that was used, and it was something that was, I guess it was about 5 foot or 150 or so centimeters high. I mean, it was the size of a decently large refrigerator, and it had this big disc. It must have been 3-4 foot wide, and that was the disc. And it was like the old record players where you'd sort of put the arm on the rotating disc, and that was one megabyte, and that was sort of an example of the early technology of discs. So it gives you an idea of how things have changed and become miniaturized. In a fairly short space of time. It's only 50 years ago that technology was the standard. Now look at it, for goodness sakes. So Toffler went on to say that increasingly, that because of the level of technology freeing up people's time, that people would more and more start working not in physical work, but where people occupied in, as he called it, brain work, would be the greater number of people. Now, I suppose it depends how we define brain work. For example, is the receptionist doesn't do any physical lifting, isn't digging the holes or planting the crops. Is that therefore brain work? Is brain work somebody laying bricks because they had to do a training course to be able to lay the bricks? And so how do we define brain work? Is somebody cutting code for a computer firm? Are they brain workers? So the definition of brain workers is vague here, but Toffler seems to really put it all into saying, well, anyone that isn't involved in physical labour is therefore, by default or definition, or by extension rather, a brain worker. You could dispute that interpretation and categorisation. Interestingly, he thought that given it was brain work, that an increasing number of people could produce productive output, brain work output, as he thought it would. And they didn't need to go into an office to do it. They could do it, as Toffler sort of said, electronic cottages and things like that. And they could consume items, not necessarily through shops, but through going to other people who had their electronic cottages. That's sort of approximation, I guess, of where we've gone there. There are more and more people that are working remotely now, or if not remotely, working independently. The computer program that sits in the corner and does their shit isn't necessarily part of a team of workers on the road digging the hole. And that creates a degree of self-sufficiency, which in turn creates social dislocation. Is where Toffler was heading with that. There is merit, by the way, in that view. Social dislocation is an issue of people being able to live independently, live their lives through their internet portal rather than physically and interacting with other people in any way. I mean, there's still school, I guess, to do the integration thing. Now, so Toffler prognosticated that, and this is the future shock business, he prognosticated, because the change is so intense and so rapid, but importantly, that it's accompanied by a new ideology that is being forced on the people. It's not something they're voting for, not organic. And this again, I think is the more important takeaway, is that the humans are shocked by these rapid changes that are occurring so rapidly and causing not simply change in again, whether you've got more time to you can do your washing quicker than you could before, but how those changes in technology are changing the way we're behaving, and how ideologies are invented by governments and those in control to exploit those changes for whatever purpose, but then forcing that on the population. Now you've got, the government isn't coming and say, well, now you've got more time to, because of washing machines or whatever, now you've got more time to do stuff. We want everyone to work. But, it's not, and then we're going to vote on it. It's not that. It's not how it's happening that way. But also there are unforeseen consequences of things. Humans are forever trying to correct problems, but not looking at the problem precisely. As an example, there was Australia's got quite large sugarcane fields, doing a lot of producing a lot of sugarcane, and is one of the world's biggest producers. But there was a certain beetle that came along that was eating the sugarcane and ruining it, and it was too expensive and difficult to control these beetles. So what was decided was there was a beetle, a very similar type, that was in some offshore island or somewhere else, and there was a frog or a toad that ate the beetle. It was a natural predator for that beetle. So somebody came to the bright, well, why don't we bring that toad to Australia? The toads will eat the beetle. Problem gone. So yeah, let's do that. Now, on the face of it, on a prima facie basis, that was a decent idea. But when the beetle that frog or that toad was eating, and wherever it came from, was a ground living beetle. It lived on the ground, therefore the toad could eat it. But the beetle in Australia, while being very similar, same type of beetle, it actually had evolved to live up the stems of the sugarcane. So it was off the ground, so the toad couldn't get to it. So the toad was then eating other things that they didn't want the toad to eat, and causing all sorts of other ecological damage. Now, on top of that, the natural predator for these toads was a particular lizard in Australia, but the toad was able to put a poisonous substance on its skin when it was being attacked, which then killed the lizards. And so the lizards were and so on. So it ended up being a fucking disaster. It's called the cane toad. And the intention was good, the prima facie, but people didn't do that sort of the heavy lifting. Instead, it created many more problems. So we see attempts to correct things or divert things or direct things in certain ways, and that end up having collateral damage that the time is unforeseen. But when it's realised, it's too late then to reverse the damage. So this future shock, that the change is so vast or so fast, and so and one change leads to another, and it leapfrogs off each other and becomes then, and this is more so in the developed countries than anywhere else. So these changes means that all the institutions that we identify with that give us stability in our lives, and this could be our family, nationalism, our professional occupations, religions, and so on, that these things are all lost given these rapid changes, or that we become disconnected from them, and this exacerbates the feeling of shock. So Toffler went through a number of things, such as, and he prognosticated that the cost of repairing things would ultimately reach a point where the cost of repairing was greater than the cost of buying a new item or owning a new item. The cost of ownership would increase. In terms of maintenance, we could say a motor vehicle, for example. There comes a point when you've got to throw so much money to keep your motor vehicle on the road. You think, holy shit, I might as well buy another one. So this was something that Toffler pointed out was going to be a huge issue, disposability of things, which also creates disconnection. If you've got something that was handed to you by your parents and they got it from their parents and so on, that creates a sense of social continuity. And when things are disposable and you have no things that you keep or of any value, or just things that something you might buy cheaply from Walmart, it does the job for a couple of years, it starts to fall to pieces. Hey, who cares? It only cost me $10. I'll just get another one. Now, if you want something that's going to last a long time, you have to pay quite a bit more. And you say, well, why do I want to do that? The utility of it is no greater than this, that's much cheaper, and so on. And if you've got no continuity, as in you intend to hand this on to your children, or relatives, or family members, if you don't have that sort of thing going anymore, then why would you do it? So this comes back to disposability. Back in the day, Toffler was talking about things like disposable ballpoint pens and cigarette lighters, the plastic cigarette lighters that were disposable. He was talking about those, but we can draw a much wider net on that today. He's also talking about classic designed goods, like a French polished, Louis XIV from the year 1702 table, which is of course an antique collector's item now. But in terms of utility, it's a table. Then he's saying that idea of classic sort of classically made, classically designed goods, that's disappearing now, and anything that is considered an antique. Whereas the idea is to have the latest design, modern marketing, I guess, have the latest design or the coolest design. We can see this in things like clothes. I remember my grandparents had, like my grandfather had a coat that he bought when he was in his 20s. And it was so well made and so well put together, and he cared for it well, that he was still using that coat. And it wasn't sort of frayed. It didn't look like it was falling to pieces or anything. It was a quality coat, quality made, quality product, quality stitched, and he still had that looking like new. Many years later, 40 years later or whatever. So that's sort of something you don't really see today. And recently, I bought a coat, as in less than 5 years ago. And it was a $400 coat, I think, and it's already needs to be thrown out. It's just not holding up very well, and it's not like I've used it every day. So that's a difference in this idea of things you don't hand on through the generations, and because of the design differences or just shabby workmanship, you're throwing it out. Also, Toffler predicted that we'll come to a point where we don't own things, we'll just simply rent them, which is very much part of the World Economic Forum thing. You'll own nothing and be happy. Everything you need, you will rent from our monopoly businesses. So we get very, very rich at your expense, you fucking peasant. So now also he's talking about, because of the changes in technology, industries will rapidly change. So the number one company from 50 years ago or 100 years ago won't exist today. This is very much been the case in, say, high technology and computer businesses. When I was a young man, the companies that existed then that were the big companies, the top 10 companies, only 2 of them are still around today. Others have been absorbed or bought out or merged or whatever, but there's very few of them exist today. And companies that made their business out of manufacturing computers and doing the software and selling them to they've now become effectively almost labour hire, maintenance and so on firms, really. And so that industrial concept of manufacturing and so on has changed as well. And Toffler did seem to be across that. Now, he was talking about because industries are going to change so quickly and so often, that will create an ever-present wave of unskilled workers, in the sense that the skills that they had are no longer relevant, because technology has moved on. And you could say this even about, say, computer coding and things like that, because there's a newer computer coding method that's come out that's the latest and the greatest, and so on, that people who were top flight coders for the previous computer language have now become, in a sense, not completely, in a sense, obsolete, because this new code is the latest and greatest buzz. So they have to retrain. So Toffler was pointing out there will always be a mass of now unskilled people, in so much as new technology has made them unskilled, rather than they have no skills or abilities to begin with. That certainly is an issue. So people have to change their professions, and this idea of a career for a lifetime is all going to be pie in the sky. I mean, it's not quite as bad as Toffler's indicating. For example, if you're a civil engineer, it does mean the building practices and technologies won't change, but as long as you incorporate your ongoing training and awareness of that your overall engineering discipline will still apply just as much today as it did last year or 10 years ago. Not that there won't be new technology products in there, but the differences will be sufficiently incremental that you're just adding a little bit of knowledge onto what you already have. So that doesn't make somebody unskilled. Toffler, again, with a very correct sort of thing here, he was predicting that because there'll be so many short-term type jobs that are needed only for the moment rather than long-term career type jobs, that there'll be jobs that most people can do, so that you can get people from third world countries to do a lot of these jobs, which will change the nature of I think that's particularly a modern interpretation and justification of mass migration. I don't think Toffler was really going down that path. I didn't see it as so at the time. And the idea of stability, continuity, and permanence, and these sorts of things, he was saying that will be affected by the future technology, which is to a large extent, I guess, a statement of the obvious. But so that's a bit about. There was a sort of a docu-film that came out, I think, in the 70s as well about future shock, but it created a bit of a talking point. I knew people at the time when I first came across it, which was some years after it was first published. And people were talking about it. Oh, it's going to be huge. I think it took longer to arrive than Toffler was indicating, and it arrived in different ways. But I think some of his points are quite good. He was quite prescient in his sort of understanding of the future. I don't think any of it was a massive, like, it's not a work of super intellectualism, like he's no fucking Nostradamus or something. But if you look at how everyone else was predicting the future, then you could say that he'd written a book that was a synthesis of an amalgam of all these other opinions, whether it be Gene Roddenberry or Isaac Asimov or whoever. But he brought those together, and I think he did put it into a coherent sort of argument. And I think in the overall balance, his look at the future was fairly close in a number of ways. As long as you don't go very specific and micro detail, then you can look at things within a broad brush and come up with a book like Future Shock. If you haven't read it already or heard about it, you can probably pick them all up at secondhand bookshops now. It's worth a look to see how people in 1970 were viewing how things would be today. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.